On this episode of the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, we're talking camp and leadership. We've always thought that there was some connection between camp and leadership development, and today we're looking at some of the data that tells that story. We're also going to look at the 4 big experiences that seem to turn people into ministry leaders. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, where we dive deeply into theology, research, and practical wisdom for camps, retreat centers, and other key ministry spaces. I'm your host, Jared Rendell, camp enthusiast and part of the Sacred Playgrounds team. This podcast features Dr. Jake Sorensen, a scholar and practitioner who's helping us all think more deeply about outdoor ministries. Wander with us what God might have in store at your Sacred Playground. Hey, welcome to the playground, everyone. Jake, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. Just really enjoying this transition to the fall season. Always love the change of colors and the fall sports and the cooler weather. Just always a wonderful time of year.
We're camp nerds a little bit, right? So we thrive some in the summer when it gets to be full season, of course. I have one thing that I like more about the rest of the year. That is the clothes. I love putting a flannel on. And even like we didn't have
You are totally a flannel guy. I love this.
Totally a flannel guy. We did some campfires at camp, but we have a little pit in our backyard and we didn't really do that much this summer. And my wife's like, that's perfect. I would rather have a bundled up fall campfire any day than get hotter when it's already 85 degrees, even
exactly. It's like, okay, it's 90 degrees, but we have to roast s'mores, everybody. I know your marshmallows are already melting, but we're going to have a campfire anyway. Yeah, the fall, I'm all about it. And the other thing I love about the fall is it's a time to really think, camp people can take a step back, see what happened this summer, look at the evaluations, but then also start dreaming about how can we make things better? What new things can we do? How can we connect with our people?
Yeah. We know, right, that they're like, there's no camp off season. That's a myth, right? The off season, that's not a thing. But it changes. It's different. It does what these leaves do, and we get to think a little bit differently. And like you said, dream a little bit, and that is a fun time for camp folks, and hopefully rest a bit too in a different way than the rest of the summer. So we're talking a bit about camp and leadership, and so this came up right because we know our camp folks. I got to have a text message thread with some of my old camp staff friends, and I was thinking about those guys, and they are pastors, and a couple of them are like senior development associates and doing fundraising in colleges, and they're teachers, and they're moms and dads too. And so we're noticing it seems like that when we have these experiences at camp, there's something that happens. There's something where we gain some confidence, we gain some skills, we are in a space where we get the chance to develop things that we might not get to in any other way. So we're talking camp and leadership, right? Some of this potential for camp experiences, both as a camper and maybe especially as a staff member, to dream and then get to practice in some ways the people we're going to be. And that is neat about camp, right? We always wonder about what's going to happen after camp. Everybody's like, great, we have these great camp experiences, and we learn, and we're talking about what happens with campers after camp. And it seems like one of the things that happens is we get to develop some leadership skills, right?
Absolutely. Camp is an awesome place to develop those leadership skills. And we know anecdotally, right? You talk about your camp friends, and I think about my camp friends as well, and the staff members that worked with me when I was a program director, and where they are now, and how many of them are pastors or church council presidents, and just are really involved, whether they're in professional ministry or they're a lay member. And so anecdotally, we know all this stuff. And so once again, we ask, well, how common is this really? And so effective camp, the camper surveys that we've done have really helped us get a sense of the camper experience and how that develops leadership. And so one of the most consistent pieces of growth in the effective camp surveys is confidence in leadership ability. So I feel confident in my ability to be a leader. It starts at one
Yeah.
point on the first day of camp. It always grows. Every single camp that we've studied more than 3 dozen camps. Every single one of them has had significant growth in that particular one. And that's the only variable in the entire survey where every camp has shown growth. So that's
Wow.
significant in itself. And then, of course, we do the 3 month follow up, 2 to 3 month follow up. And that is one that is, again, consistently still high in the months following camp. And that's pretty significant. So it's not something that just like, oh, I feel confident as a leader and then it drops off again. That stays at the post camp levels, which is really exciting. And so we see that with the campers. And again, they're only there for 5, 6 days, maybe 7 days, depending on the camp.
Right.
Um, what about these summer staff members who are there for 8, 10, 12 weeks at a time? What is the camp experience doing for them in terms of their leadership development? And that's something that we were really interested in looking at. Of course, we wanted to start with the camper experience. That's kind of the core of the camp experience. But so many people have been asking us, what about the summer staff experience? And it's really exciting that we finally get to kind of turn that corner and look at summer staff.
So if you're listening right now and you got the chance to be on summer staff, think about that. Reflect on that for a second as you're listening. What difference do you think that made? What did those summer staff experiences, camper experiences too? What difference did those make in where you are now, in the role, in the vocation that you've got right now? And then think about those other people too. Think about those friends and fellow camp folks. What are they doing right now? What in what ways did they get developed through those experiences? And like you said, Jake, that was an interesting thing to start the study. So the team did. The team was curious about that, right? And that's where the Camp and Church Leadership Project came from. And so
You got it.
we're partway through that project. Um, there have been a couple significant parts. So can you tell us, give us the overview first? Tell us about this project. A little bit of where it came from. You've covered. Um, what made this so interesting, and give us an overview of the project.
Yeah. So this project is focused specifically on one church group of camps. And so that's the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And the reason is because that's where the funding came from. So we always like these grant funded projects because the camps don't have to like buy into an evaluation process, can design a study when we have these grant funded projects. And so the grant came from the ELCA, Youth and Young Adult Leadership, and they funded this project so that we could look specifically at the impacts of working on summer camp staff um, towards leadership development in the church. And so we're looking at this from a lay ministry perspective, but also a rostered ministry perspective. So the pastors and the deacons, how many of them worked at camp? We're curious about all these different things. But what we started with was exactly what you're talking about. We started with stories. And so we approached uh, several camps here in Wisconsin. We started in Wisconsin in the different synods, and we had the synod offices recommend different people that had worked at camps in the past that were now active in church in some way. And we did half pastors and half lay leaders. And we found out how their summer staff experience fit in with their leadership development. And what were the key moments in those summer staff experiences that led them in new directions in their life? And so for some of them, it was a really life changing experience. And for others, it was sort of like it wasn't exactly life changing, but it sort of fit in with the other things that were going on in their lives. And so it really did matter who they were and where they came from. So they started out as this, kind of unique person who comes into the camp experience. So you got this particular life story that is joined into this community of common purpose, this summer staff community that bonds really closely, and they have these shared goals of sharing faith with these young people, with keeping them safe, with leading them and developing them in their social skills, in their self-confidence, and in their faith. And the Holy Spirit is at work in all of this. And
Mhm.
as they come through this experience and participate in experiential leadership in the camp environment, they have all these different outcomes that we were able to list. Things like lasting relationships. So some of them have been friends for 40 years. We looked at people that have been on staff recently and some that have been on that were on staff decades ago. So they have these relationships that last for decades. They come out with new skills, they come out with stronger faith, they come out with a new sense of vocation and calling in a lot of cases,
Mhm.
and then a lot of times an ongoing connection to the camp itself and to camping ministry. And so these are some of the outcomes that we sort of saw in this kind of first phase of the project. And we took these findings and then we went into this survey research. And the way that we started the survey research is we looked at the entire roster of ELCA ministers. And so that's all the pastors and deacons in the ELCA. And there are about 14,000 of them. And so we were able to get a hold of the church-wide office, and they sent out this survey to all of the rostered ministers. And so it was a great partnership in that way. We got more than 3,000 responses. And so we
Wow.
really got a very strong data set. We heard from ministers across the country in all of the 65 synods of the ELCA. And it was pretty well distributed. We had a great breakdown in terms of gender, in terms of age, those that were retired and those that were new clergy. And so it was a really good demographic mix of the folks that was really representative of the
Mhm.
entire ELCA roster. So really excited about the data set that we were able to get.
Yeah, that's a lot of good info, and it'll be really interesting to see as the project continues to pan out. Um, what I what are the main things? I'm curious if anything so far, right? Because we've got some of the data right now, and we'll tell everybody in a minute about how they can take in some of that. And there's a piece you can download about those rostered leaders in particular. I'm curious, Jake. Though, is there anything that was surprising so far? Anything that was particularly surprising or interesting in the data that the team's been able to crunch so far?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to say it blew our mind, but it really did lead us in new directions in our understanding of kind of how camp fits into this big puzzle of ministry spaces. First of all, it was no surprise to us that camp really shone. That it really is this incredibly important spot for leadership development and faith formation among ELCA clergy members. It was basically the number one space for leadership development
Mm,
of all the ministry spaces that we looked at. We looked
wow.
at a lot of different ones. And so we wanted to kind of put it into context. We didn't ask just about camp. We asked about all these other things, all these other experiences that they've had, whether they attended church as a kid, whether they went to Sunday school, VBS, whether they went to the big national youth gathering that the ELCA
Mhm.
does, mission trips, campus ministry, like all these different things. We asked about all these things, and camp really rose to the top as this incredibly moving space for leadership development. And so, just off the top, just looking at how many people experienced camp, about 2/3 of the rostered ministers had been a camper at an overnight camp, a Christian overnight camp. And so that's a big number that
Yeah.
that went to camp. And then it was almost half. It was 44% that worked on summer camp staff. You think about a number like that, and that's a ton of rostered ministers that worked on summer camp staff.
Mhm.
And so if you look at just these two groups, just the people that had these camp experiences, 91% of them said that camp had a significant impact on their life. 80% said they learned a new skill that they still use today in their ministry. And 20%, one in five, met their spouse at camp. You always laugh at this because you wonder how many is it really? Like I met my spouse at camp, and it's a ton of
Uh-huh.
people that meet their spouse at camp, right? And so
We got married at
um,
camp.
you got married
We
at
didn't
camp
meet
too,
there,
yeah,
but we got married
exactly.
at camp.
That's fantastic.
That's probably the most, maybe the most common camp joke, but everybody came up with it themselves, where so and so Bible camp gets replaced with so and so bridal camp. Heard that maybe way too much.
That does. I mean, it's a thing, right? I mean,
That's a
people.
big percentage.
It is a big percentage. You develop these relationships in the camp environment, and you've obviously got similar interests when you're working at camp together. It's just a, kind of that natural place for
Jokes
people. But
aside, right? Because when you when you put all that together, what it tells you is that these camp experiences have significant impact on like some of the most important parts of your life, your relationships and your calling, your vocation.
You got it.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the of those that worked on summer camp staff, 3/4 of them said that the experience of working on summer camp staff was very or extremely important in developing their call to rostered ministry. That's a huge percentage that said that,
it
more
is.
than any other ministry space that we measured.
Oh,
That's incredible. So it was cool to see that, and it was, confirming of some of those things that we found in sort of phase one of the study when we were doing those interviews. But one of the things that really surprised us was some of these other ministry spaces and how they fit in as well. And so, we knew that camp didn't stand on its own. It wasn't like, oh, I'm not really sure what I want to do with my life. And then I go to camp and suddenly I'm a Christian and I'm going to become a pastor. There are lots of things that lead up to this. There are mentors in people's lives, there are other key experiences. And so usually camp was not sort of this standalone experience. Now, for some people, it was, but
sure.
for the majority of people, it fit in with this larger ecology of faith formation. And it's the same sort of thing that we talk about with the campers. I mean, there's this sort of ecology of faith formation. Camp fits in and helps embed them further into congregational ministry, into youth ministry, leads them to become more interested in Christian community groups and small groups, all these other things that build faith. The same can be said for camp in terms of working on summer staff. And so camp was essentially one of what we sort of are calling the big four, these ministry spaces that
Mhm.
were all incredibly influential in developing these rostered ministers. And so the big four are Sunday school, which I think was the biggest surprise, camp, of course, as we said, this national youth gathering that the ELCA does
Mhm.
every 3 years, and campus ministry. And so,
Sure.
in some ways, it's like, okay, these ministry spaces make sense. I think the gathering was a bit of a surprise to us. A lot of times there's this or maybe unhealthy rivalry between camps and the gathering,
Mhm.
because the gathering happens in the summer.
Just
And
taking
so
up
every
time.
three
Sure.
years, the camper numbers tend to dip because so many kids go to this gathering. I mean, it's 30 or 40,000 high schoolers go to this national youth
Mm.
gathering every 3 years in the ELCA. So that's a lot of kids that are going to that. But it's clear that they feed into one another. And so the kids that go to camp are more likely to go to the gathering. The kids that go to the gathering are more likely to go to camp and work at camp. And so they're mutually reinforcing.
Sure.
It's not this rivalry that we sometimes think of. Um, they're indispensable to one another. And I think that is a big surprise when you think of something like that. And so maybe
Mhm.
it's the wrong perspective to think of, oh, every 3 years, the gathering takes kids away from camp. It might be almost the opposite in that on the other 2 years, there are more kids going to camp because of the gathering.
Mhm.
So it builds up these other ministries and the congregational ministries as well. So leading kids into these other ministries. And so it was really interesting. I thought Sunday school was one that just I had to do the numbers like 3, 4 different ways and try to figure out what is going on with Sunday school here, because you might expect something like youth group to
Mhm.
really shine, or mission trips or something like that, and those didn't really break into what we would call the big four. But Sunday school was almost this ubiquitous experience. So many of the rostered ministers had experiences as young people in the church
Mm.
and saw those experiences as incredibly influential. And so they would deem their Sunday school experiences as more important, as a whole. Again, this is 3,000 that we're talking about. As a whole, those experiences as more important to them and their faith and their call to ministry than something like confirmation, youth group, mission trips, things like that.
Wow.
And so I said, the 75, the about 3/4 of those who worked on summer camp staff said it was very or extremely important to their call to ministry. That was only of those 44% that worked at camp, because there were 90 something percent that attended Sunday school monthly or more when they were kids. There were actually more as a total number that said that Sunday school was very or extremely important to their call to ministry than even said working at camp
Hmm.
because of the sheer numbers of those that had these experiences. And so there's so much talk about, changing Sunday school, do it a different way, or stop doing it altogether. Is it really that important? Yes, it is.
Apparently.
This is a ministry that we have to invest in. Children's ministry is incredibly important, incredibly important,
Hmm.
and it feeds into ministries like camp. It's one of
Yeah.
the primary recruiting grounds for kids to go to camp. We talked in a different episode about the Camp to Congregation Project, about traveling day camp,
Right.
and about its connection to vacation Bible school ministries, and how those sorts of ministries bring people into the church, engage them in a ministry like a Sunday school or other children's ministries that the church might have, and also bring them into the camp experience. And so all these things are mutually reinforcing. We need all of them. And so when we talk about the big four, however, we might say these are the ones that are really the core.
Hmm.
They're indispensable. These are the ones that we need to invest in, and we need to speak well of. We need to encourage young people to participate in these things. And unfortunately, when we look at those four, Sunday school, camp, the National Youth Gathering, or these big youth conventions, campus ministry, a lot of times these are the ministries that um, folks are divesting from and saying, "Oh, I don't know if we can afford that because we're doing these other things." Well, if you can't afford that, then the entire church is going to suffer.
So here's what's interesting about all that to me, that those big four, a lot of them, right? You think campus ministry, you think about a lot of times when they're going to gatherings like that, like the big youth gathering, and then that especially those early things match incredibly developmental times in life. Right, there's all this research, and we've got, around the country and the world, they're investing into early childhood education like crazy. Right, things have come out even in the past few years, and a lot of states are doing, state supported preschool programs now. Right, they're building that into schools and covering the cost. So that's interesting that that matches right then when we're developing early in life, these early times where there's so much physical and of course, development for the rest of our lives are going on, and then to this time where we're transitioning from adolescence to adulthood.
You
And
got it.
so there are these two really important times where these ministries can meet, right? And so they match, they come alongside these. That's interesting from, brain science and, child and young adult development perspectives, that these ministries match that.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just it's really cool to see these things come to the forefront of a study like this. Just to give a sense, I know we have to take a break, but just to give a sense of the significance of these four, we talk about, call to ministry, and some people have sort of these winding paths to their call to ministry,
Hmm.
and some don't get ordained until they're in their 40s or 50s, and that's
Right.
great. They've had this other path, um, but some are ordained much younger. And so if we look at just something like how old they are when they were ordained, and the relation to these four ministries, if they did any one of these things, if they attended camp multiple times, if they served on summer camp staff at least once, if they attended an ELCA college or attended campus ministry monthly or more, or they attended the National Youth Gathering, if they did any one of those, the median age when they were rostered was 29 years old.
Mm.
Now, if they did none of them, the median age they were rostered was 41.
Wow.
You think of the difference between those two
Wow.
numbers. Just one of those big four, 29 years old. None of them, 41. Incredibly significant ministries.
Yeah, it is. That's really interesting. Um, right. So close circuit the parents before the break here. Right. These aren't either ors, like you said. It's not this competition thing. The good things that can happen in our lives, in the lives of our kids, when when we are giving them the opportunity to do, yeah, maybe one. What about two? Or what if they get a chance to do all three of those? What if they get a chance to do all four of those? Um,
Almost nobody did one, you
yeah,
know? when
Yeah,
they did one, they were incredibly likely to do two,
to do
three,
the
or four
others.
of them. Yep.
Sure, sure. So close circuit to parents. If let's set your kids on a good path. Heads up, these big four have some interesting things. So, and leaders come out of this, like you're saying. So we're gonna come back to the project, talk about what's next for the Camp and Church Leadership Project, and see what kind of next steps everybody can take.
Do you like what you're hearing? Go deeper into the research and best practices of Christian camping with Sacred Playgrounds, the book. This brand new resource is Jake's most comprehensive contribution to the field of outdoor ministry. It is loaded with stories and research from Christian camps across the country and around the world. It traces the history and theology of outdoor ministry, focusing on the 5 fundamental characteristics of Christian summer camp. This is the premier resource for Christian camp professionals, church leaders, camper parents, and all those passionate about camping ministry. Order Sacred Playgrounds wherever you get your books.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Jake, we're through phase 1 of the project, correct?
Phase 1 and 2. So the clergy survey was stage 2. Yep.
That's right. That's right. So tell us what's next. The Camp and Church Leadership Project. We have some findings right now, crunching data right now. What's ahead for this project?
Yeah, so this phase 2, this clergy survey is done. We've got the findings on the website. They're ready to go. We're rolling them out in several different ways. What's happening right now with the data gathering is a survey of summer camp staff. So the current cohort of summer camp staff have taken surveys at the very beginning of the summer and then again at the end of the summer. And so they've all finished doing these surveys, and I am now receiving the last of the paper surveys. And so I'm just starting to input the data, and then we'll crunch the numbers and see what were the impacts on this current cohort of summer camp staff. I'm really excited to see what that might be and how we can measure those things. And so it's kind of the before and after, sort of like we did in the Effective Camp Project.
All right, so maybe this is a little inside baseball, but let's see if let's see if you have honed your projection skills, your guessing skills. If you could guess a little on what we're gonna find, what are your initial expectations? What do you think might happen out of these summer staff surveys?
Well, first of all, I think the leadership piece is going to be far and away the biggest growth. I think we're going to see that for sure across the different camps. So over 50 camps participated in this project. We have over 1,000 summer camp staff that participated. And so that's really exciting. Wow. I think what we're going to see is, and what I'm hoping that we'll see, is the difference in experience and how that affects the outcomes and the impacts. And so how burnt out are these staff at the end of the summer? How much support did they feel like they received during the summer in various ways from their coworkers, from their supervisors? How was the experience? And then how can we then look at data like that and improve the summer camp experience so that we're improving the outcomes for these summer camp staff? And because we're improving the outcomes for the summer camp staff, because we're improving the experience, we are also improving the experience for the summer campers.
Yeah.
Because the summer camp community is a reflection of the summer staff community. So I'm really excited about looking at this. I am a little apprehensive because of the COVID summer that we just had.
Sure.
And that a lot of camps were short-staffed. I'm wondering how that affected mental health this summer, how that affected burnout, things like that.
Yeah, we've talked about that some in the other episode about how we know it did some, right? We know it affected some. We heard from directors, we heard from some staff themselves. So it will be really interesting and maybe even more significant if we do see some of what you expect, to say that even though there's some curveballs, we still had these summer staff come out and say, I grew.
I expect that. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And so, I mean, the ultimate goal is to move into a phase of summer staff training where we can really offer some input on how we can work through summer staff training to develop these young leaders and prepare them for their role in summer camp, but also um, put them on the trajectory where they're really thinking about leadership in the church, whether that be
Mhm.
rostered leadership or that is lay leadership. There's so many different ways to serve. It's not just you have to become a pastor,
Yeah.
or a youth minister. So many ways to serve God and serve the church.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if they are listening and they are a camp director, a church leader, maybe a parent listening, what are some of the things they can do right now to take a look at what we've got so far? Maybe use and apply and mess with that a little in their own context. What are some takeaways that they could do right now?
Yeah, I think the easy thing if they just want to get a quick overview is to look at that quick fact sheet. It's right on the website, right on the Camp to Congregation, or I'm sorry, the Camp and Church Leadership Project
Yeah,
website, and they can check that out and look at some of the numbers. There's also a full report, so they can look at that. But if they're really interested in, like, how do I apply this, looking at those big four ministries in their congregational context and saying, how can we improve these ministries? How can we emphasize these things? How are we supporting our local campus ministry, for example? How are we really developing and putting time and effort into this Sunday school program? I know that Sunday school is hard. You know, so many of our congregations struggle. They struggle to find teachers. They struggle with
sure.
curriculum. They struggle to develop a program, and it always seems like you're reinventing it. That's the way we have to do it sometimes. It's worth it. It's so worth it to be doing that. How are you connecting to your local camp? Um, are you um, are you in contact with the director? Are you in contact with the staff? Are you offering input and supporting them in whatever ways you can? Those partnerships are so important, and so those are some of the practical things we can do. One of the things that we really found in the clergy survey is that um, the ELCA ministers, by and large, are supporters of camp, but not all of them are. Some of them are detractors. Some of them we might call
Sure.
camp skeptics, and so it's a fairly low percentage, but it's significant. It's about 18% are what we would
Mm,
call camp skeptics, and so they're probably not going to show up at camp. They might not speak well of camp. They're pretty skeptical about the impacts that camp can bring. Maybe they had a personally bad experience at camp,
sure.
or they've heard of somebody with a bad experience. But um, for the most part, uh, these clergy members in the Lutheran Church are camp enthusiasts, or at least accommodators. People that are supportive of camp, and the
Yeah.
idea of camp. And so connecting with those folks, identifying who they are, and really trying to connect with them. If you're a camp director or camp leader, um, engage them in the ministries and try to get their input and help them feel like they're a part of the family, and they have some important input in your programming. Um, Invite them to staff training. I think that's a big piece as you're planning a staff training session. Really look at um, and understand how you are developing these young people for leadership. Bring in somebody that can talk about rostered ministry. Have you considered it? You know, Bring
Mhm.
in somebody, a bishop. Bishop would love to come, I'm sure, or a local pastor that can talk about their trajectory, their call to ministry, and plant that seed in these young people's minds, because we need strong pastors in the church. And in that same conversation, it can be, you don't have to become a pastor to be a strong leader in the
Sure.
church. We need you engaged in congregational ministry. Here are some of the amazing things that congregational ministries do. A lot of these young adults, they get skeptical about congregational ministry. Oh, is this really for me? Do I really need to be part of a congregation? Even though most of them, their faith was formed in the congregational setting, they're still like, yeah, maybe, but congregational ministry is not for me. And really emphasizing that this is important. Developing these relationships across the generations is incredibly important. And so really planting those seeds in the young people's minds and engaging them in congregational ministries in as many ways as you can, so that they develop an understanding of the value of these ministries.
There's your next steps, everybody. Go download that quick fact sheet. It's really interesting. It's packed with data. There's one. Two, stay tuned. There's more to find from this project, and We will roll it out when these numbers come in and they get crunched. And then, would you let us know what intersections you find in your own leadership, in your own development, and your time at camp? We'd love to hear those stories. Whether you find us out in social media spaces like Instagram or Facebook, or send us an email, which you can find all that info at sacredplaygrounds.com. The particular site for this, so if you go to sacredplaygrounds.com, /CCLP, that's where you'll find everything on this project. We'll post that out there in a few different spots, and we will see you next time at the playground. Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. This episode was produced by me, Jared Rendell, and featured Dr. Jake Sorensen, lead researcher and founder at Sacred Playgrounds, LLC. Our theme music was written and performed by Taylor Wilson. You can find his original songs wherever you get your music. Learn more and connect with the Sacred Playgrounds team at sacredplaygrounds.com.